I'm sure many of you saw the pictures of statues and tributes of various historical figures being torn down, defaced and graffitied over the last year. And the one which instantly springs to my mind is one of Edward Colston in Bristol, who was pulled down and chucked into the harbour. All of these arose during the Black Lives Matter protests which were occurring across the world. These figures were all targeted due to their association with things like colonisation and the slave trade. One of the most pertinent of these, which you can probably think of, is the Atlantic slave trade, where black Africans were ripped from their families, transported across the ocean like cargo, and sold to white colonisers to labour on their farms and plantations. And sadly, slavery is something which still occurs today. It is estimated that there are 40 million people who are currently living in some form of slavery. This can take the form of human trafficking, forced labour, debt bondage, or child slavery. As we've already established, history is littered with occurrences of slavery. This includes the Bible. One of the most famous of these is the story of Joseph. Joseph the dreamer, the man with the multicoloured coat. He got on his brother's nerves, and eventually their jealousy overflowed and they grabbed him and sold him to some Ishmaelite traders. The guy was then sold into slavery to the Egyptians. He then got a big promotion, but then he was unjustly thrown into prison. But then he eventually rose up again to become Pharaoh's right-hand man. We see how God was working through the situation and how he used Joseph to save countless lives from a great famine. There's also a time where Abraham slept with Hagar, his wife's slave girl, in an attempt to speed up God's plan. And there's the account of Paul sending an escaped slave, Onesimus, back to his master Philemon. All of these accounts raises the question, does the Bible condone slavery? Before specifically examining how the Bible addresses slavery, we need to consider terminology. The Hebrew word ibed and the Greek word doulos can be translated as slave. However, these words more frequently refer to a servant or a bondservant. In the past, there used to be a lot of overlap between the terms slave and servant, but these terms have now used to describe very different things. In the Bible, the terms ibed and doulos were not inherently negative, but were used in relation to work. In both cases, it was possible for a servant to be a person of honour and to be able to advance within a household. In the Old Testament, it was used to show that person was subservient to someone else. So in Israel, everyone was ultimately regarded as a servant to the king, while the king themselves was a servant to God. This meant that everyone was subservient to someone else. So now let's take a look at what the Old Testament says about slavery. Within Israel, slavery was not based on race. It was based on economics and social status. It was seen as a way to provide for a family and provide people with a form of employment which was preferable to destitution. A lot of the time, slaves were debt servants who were working to pay off what they owed. In these cases, Israel would work for a maximum of 6 years, and then they had two choices. So one, they could choose to return to their own household. If they picked this option, their master would send them on their way with flocks and supplies, help them get back onto their own feet. Alternatively, they could decide to remain as a permanent member of their master's household. For many, this would have been a better option as they were likely to enjoy a higher quality of life under their master's protection. There are also a number of laws set in place to regulate slavery. There were laws which provided protection and privilege for servants, for example, ensuring that they had the Sabbath off. There were also laws which meant that a slave could be freed if they suffered a permanent injury. In Deuteronomy 15, there was the law that said it was illegal to return a runaway slave, but that they were to let the slave live wherever they wanted. This effectively meant the Israelite slaves could voluntarily break their service contract by leaving. The other key law to do with slavery is found in Exodus 21. It states, "Whoever steals a man and sells him, and anyone found in possession of him, shall be put to death." This highlights that slave catching and selling was a capital offence deserving of death. And I guess just demonstrates how the Bible stands against the slavery which occurred between the 16th and 19th centuries. So what we can see is that the Old Testament passages were commands which were expressing the moral will of God for a specific people at a specific time and for a specific purpose. God was setting up a political entity and he was providing with the law for Israel. In contrast, the New Testament is set in a very different context. The church was living under the law of the Roman Empire. So God is only providing his people with instructions of how to live within the social structure they were in. Within the Roman Empire, slavery was quite a common institution, and slaves were viewed in a slightly different light than they were within Israel. There were three main ways by which a person was made a slave. It was to pay a debt, like we saw with Israel, if they were captured in a war, or if they were born within the slave class. Within this society, slavery wasn't based on a person's race, and it was often temporary. Slaves also had the potential to earn property in other slaves. But slavery in this time differed, as slaves could not represent themselves legally, they were subject to arrest in ways a freed person wasn't, and their living conditions were heavily reliant on the nature of their master. Paul addresses the issue of slavery in the book of Philemon. When taken at face value, it looks like Paul is sending a slave named Onesimus back to his master who he had fled from. But when examined more deeply, Paul is making some radical assertions. We see how highly he values Onesimus. He refers to Onesimus as his child and as a piece of his heart. We see that Paul regards Onesimus as a person who is on the same level as himself rather than as a piece of property. Paul goes beyond this by redefining the relationship between Philemon and Onesimus. Beforehand, it was a master-slave dynamic, but now Onesimus had come to Christ. Onesimus was not returned to Philemon as a slave, but as more than a slave. In fact, he was a brother to Philemon. They were both equal in Christ. In Matthew 20, Jesus also tears up the script. He says, "Whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be your slave. Even as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." Like, this is mind-blowing. Like, Jesus is suggesting that status in his kingdom is found by being at the bottom of the pile, by serving others. Jesus also lived by this philosophy. Like, the reason why he came down to earth was to be a slave whose life was to be traded for all others. This is epitomized in the Last Supper when Jesus literally took on the role of a slave by washing the feet of his disciples. His death also presents this image as crucifixion was the way slaves who rebelled against the empire were executed. Jesus, God himself, left his royal status in heaven so as to live and to die as a slave so salvation could be bought for all. So why didn't the likes of Jesus and Paul come out with explicit statements against slavery or cause radical change within the society they were in? Well, at the time, Christians didn't have much in the way of political influence. They would have been typically viewed as some upstart wacky cult. And if they had sought to incite the slave uprising, it would have been compelling slaves to death due to the might of the Roman Empire at the time. Like, it's pretty much impossible for people to transform the Roman society, as the Roman Empire would go on to last for another 400 years. Instead, Christians sought to change the society from the bottom up. They started a countercultural movement within the empire which challenged the existence of masters and slaves by teaching that all were equal. What can we take away from all of this? When the Bible does not explicitly denounce slavery, this does not mean the Bible endorses it. In fact, the Bible outlines several principles which strike the idea of slavery down at its very core and demands slavery's demise. Paul condemns the institution and practice of slavery in 1 Timothy when he places slave traders alongside the lawless, the disobedient, the ungodly and the sinners, the murderers and the sexually immoral. He places them alongside all these acts which he describes as being contrary to sound doctrine. Another of these principles can be found right at the beginning of the Bible. In Genesis 1:27 it says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created them. Male and female he created them." All of humanity is made in God's image. There is no distinction between races. No matter what colour of skin you have, you are made in the image of God. And this condemns the race-based slavery which occurred predominantly throughout the 16th to 19th centuries. The idea of equality between all people can also be seen in other parts of the Bible. For example, there is a description of the church in Galatians 3 when it says, "There is neither Jew nor Greek, there is neither slave nor free, there is no male or female, for ye are all one in Christ Jesus." And God's kingdom is described as a great multitude that no one can count, from every nation, tribe, people and language, standing before the throne and before the Lamb. Racial, social, religious divisions have been overcome at the cross. There is no distinction. Their background or status does not matter. What truly matters is that they have recognized how Jesus died upon the cross for their sins and rose again. They have repented of their sins and accepted the forgiveness being offered to them. And as a result, they are all united in one body in Christ. As well as demonstrating how all people are equal, the Bible calls us to treat people in this way. Jesus states that you shall love your neighbour as yourself. This command is followed by the parable of the Good Samaritan. You're no doubt familiar with this tale where a man gets robbed and left for dead. A priest comes by, but he crosses the other side of the road and leaves the man. A Levite then approaches and he also ignores the man. But then a Samaritan, a person who belonged to one of Israel's great enemies at this time, he comes up to the man. He casts aside the prejudice, the animosity, and he treats the man's wounds and takes him to an inn. This demonstrates that we are to treat everyone equally, no matter where they are from or what they look like. This whole concept flies in the face of slavery. It's impossible to love your neighbour being anyone you encounter, while keeping them enslaved and denying them their personal freedom. So what we see is that the Bible does not condone slavery. In fact, it promotes equality and unity for all people. This leads both Christians and wider society to challenge to eradicate the slavery which still exists in the world today.